Uh, Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 72nd call of the Amazon Investor Coalition. This is a call and podcast series dedicated to advancing forest conservation and forest-friendly economic development and the rule of law across the Amazon region of South America. I'm going to ask everyone who's not a presenter on the call to go on mute. Hold on one second. This week, we are featuring the work of Brendan Doherty and Terraformation. Brendan, are you with us?
I am. Hello, everyone.
Great. Brendan, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? Tell us a little bit about your life before Terraformation.
Gosh, it's like BC, life before Terraformation. So I, grew up in actually a pretty small little town in Massachusetts, about 40 kids in my class, kind of small. And but what was, I think, unique about the town that I grew up in is on the ocean, on Cape Cod, was that the ocean was always this place of deep reverence for us that grew up there, and for many who visit it, worthy of conservation and of respect, of kind of all the things that we associate when we find ourselves in awe of nature. But it also was the economic engine of our town. A lot of, probably half of my high school friends, and still to this day, my friends that stay in Chatham, are commercial fishermen, shell fishermen, lobstermen, and women. But this idea that really the ocean can be both an economic engine and a natural resource worthy of awe and conservation, has always been this through line of my life. And I didn't really know it at the time. I just was sort of young and just loved being on the ocean. But looking back, I see how that really kind of led me to Terraformation. There were a couple stops along the way. I worked for two US presidents, Bush and Obama, at the State Department in particular, for several of our senior officials. Most of it focused for me on the region of sub-Saharan Africa. I've lived and worked on every continent, aside from Antarctica, but I've done a lot of work in human rights, refugees, economics, kind of broadly the space of what we would call human security. And that's something that I think is interesting about when we talk about these issues in this call today. Where does the environment interface with human well-being and workforce development and economics and community value? So I had some government experience, have run a couple nonprofits in Nepal and in Turkey, and Myanmar, and then sort of most recently had been pretty heavily in the space of impact investing. I built and ran a division for Forbes called Forbes Impact, all around impact investing, and then now do some of that myself, but also at Terraformation, head up a lot of our commercial work for Terraformation in North and South America and in Africa. And then one other part of it I just want to mention is that I have one of my favorite colleagues on the phone with us right now, Emily Grave, who is joining us from Hawaii, which is where we're headquartered. And she is a leader on our forestry partnerships team, an ethnobotanist by training, and an incredible resource for our company. And Emily, do you want to just say hello for a minute?
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. That was a lovely introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm Emily Grave. I'm the partnership lead for Terraformation in the North America and Central America and in Hawaii. And thanks for having me. So good, nice to be here and meet you all.
Great. Thanks so much for joining us. Brendan, let's go into the next question.
And Jonah, by the way, if it's helpful, I've got a small presentation I can do if folks, in any order you want, but just wanted to also let you know if that's helpful.
Great. We'll go into this next question, and then why don't you go ahead and use it as an excuse to pull up the deck. So the next question is, what's the origin story of Terraformation?
Yeah. So by show of, well, I guess we don't have too many folks on camera, but I was going to say, not sure how many folks know of Terraformation or have maybe heard about it or read about it, but it was started by Yishan Wang. Yishan was most recently the CEO of Reddit, and he was also one of the lesser known ones, but one of the PayPal mafia. I mean, to be lesser known in that mafia is is understandable when you've got Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and others. But he was part of that small group of folks that was very early at PayPal, worked at Facebook, and had a sort of whole tech career. But like many of us, really found himself in a position of seeing the urgency and the sort of existential needs facing us around climate change. And so several years ago, he started just going really deep on, what could my next chapter be related to climate, to really pour my, all the things I do into it. And out of that was born Terraformation. It really came about because he had been living in Hawaii for many years and still does, which is part of why we're headquartered there. But he had wanted to use some land that he owned there, what he thought was as an eco village, almost like some houses all centered around, very kind of forward-leaning environmental practices and innovation and technology and hardware. And what he did was he invited several experts in forestry to come over and make recommendations on how they might do that on that property. And the woman who came over that really kind of won the day was a woman named Jill, who is our head of forestry now today. And she said, look, what you really need to do here is restore this land with native species. And it was a piece of property. I don't know if any of you have spent much time on the big island of Hawaii, but it is this, two very different, multiple, but two very different ecosystems. On the east side of the island, you get 200 plus inches of rain a year. It feels very tropical and jungly. On the northeast or northwest side, we're talking 8 or 9, 10 inches of rain a year. And it's been overgrazed by cattle over many decades. And it almost feels very lunar in its landscape. And that's where we have the property that Yishan has, that kind of started this whole idea of how could we restore some of the most hard to restore lands in the world. And could we? And if we could be successful at that, were there lessons and pilots that we could then apply more broadly? And in particular, bringing in some of this scalability mindset that Silicon Valley sort of has an abundance in some ways. Could we take some of that background that Yishan has and some of his peer group and begin the journey of terraformation? So if it's helpful, I'm happy to not show a deck. I mean, I'm happy to obviously answer questions, but if it's helpful just for folks in the room, for me to take 10 minutes to kind of run through like some core areas of terraformation through that, it might be. Does that sound good, Jonah? Or?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. Real quick.
Yeah. Very quick. So can everyone see the deck?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So here is basically, at our most core is that, we are aiming to help restore 3 billion acres of degraded land globally. That is a huge number of acres, clearly. But it's really about how do we add this net additional forestry to absorb enough CO2 to really give humanity 50 to 100 years to draw back down that carbon and sequester it. So we have a pretty big mission in our, this is for the team I was alluding to, which is Yishan, who's former technology, and then Jill, who is our chief forestry officer. We recognize that to solve a challenge as sort of massive as this, you can't just do it with, a sort of singular group of folks. There has to be such a multifaceted team. And so that's what we've really built. And that's honestly what attracted me to terraformation. You have folks like Jill who've been doing forestry for, decades. You have Yishan and many of the sort of software engineers and others that we brought in. But you also have folks like Dr. Meyer, who, was is one of our carbon strategists and scientists who originally was at NASA. So we're sort of really blending together this team, which now has grown to 100 folks. And here is a slide that sort of digs into really like first principles for us, which is to say, if you really want to maximize carbon sequestration over a multi-decade time span, then, the idea is how can we really pack as much life per hectare into a space? And the way you do that is You do it, through native species and biodiversity. And so for us, we only focused on native species and native species restoration. And we don't really think about it, probably like many of you, as a sort of specifically a tree by tree basis. We really think of it as what can trees unlock more broadly in an ecosystem. And that might be under the soil, it might be around the soil, it might be on top of the soil, it's all the other flora and fauna around that. This next slide is to say, look, for us, and this maybe is an interesting question we can talk a little bit more about, is why did we form ourselves as a company as opposed to a nonprofit? Because our mission is so deeply, a climate-driven mission, a biodiversity-driven mission. And, the answer is that, generating biodiversity is not only great for carbon sequestration, but it's also good business. And there's several white papers that have come out recently from Frontier Economics and Vivid Economics that talk about, this $1 trillion business opportunity in forestry for carbon sequestration and biodiversity. And we also know that there's, as you all know, there's many different revenue sources that can also accompany that, revenue streams from agroforestry to carbon to solar and beyond. So we're really trying to tap these two combining forces to do this 1 billion acres global commitment. There has been already a lot of commitments out there. And by the way, sorry if I'm going quickly, I just honestly want to leave more time for questions and things like that. But there's clearly plenty of land available to regenerate this. And there's already, over 1 billion acres that have been committed by governments and large landholders. And there's, we believe, many more billions of acres that could be, that are already degraded or desertified, that potentially can be brought back on for reforestation, afforestation, depending on kind of the time scale of it. So that's where we're really trying to go in terms of size and scale. This is just an example of the capital piece. There is a lot of capital out there. There's plenty of it in many ways, but in some ways that's not really the challenge. And we'll get to what are some of the bottlenecks in a second. One very clear trend that we see, it's not like anything, it's a forecast, it's not a definite, but it's that there are a lot of projections around the cost of carbon and frankly, quality carbon, which is where we really focus, that it will be rising, over the next 30 years. Bloomberg just came out with a report kind of offering different scenarios on how that could go. But the idea is that carbon and the cost of nature-based solutions will continue to rise and therefore can provide some of the economics to this large-scale restoration and reforestation. So here's kind of the nub for us. We're really trying to address the bottlenecks to scale. And that's something that is also a first principle for us, is that, we, with our partners, including everyone on this call, want to say, how do we unlock the challenges that hold us back from scaling forests? Because it's clear there's expertise in the world, it's clear there's capital in the world, there's all these elements, but what's holding us back? So here are 3 areas where we've really leaned in to address. One is seed banks and seed infrastructure, as well as the training around that. The second is biodiversity and the tracking around that, which then allows you to measure outcomes, which ultimately helps in the underwriting of the project and allows the capital to be unlocked. And then the third bottleneck is this early risk capital. There's just not a lot of capital in the space at an early stage for reforestation projects, that it's so high risk, and yet it's such a critical phase of restoration. So let me just jump into this quickly. And one of the things that Emily's amazing at is our seed banking and seed storage. And so we can happy to go into all of that in more detail, but seed storage is really a key part of this. And when I say that, it's not a sort of like the, vault of seeds that we see in Norway or the UK, where it's sort of break in case of emergency. What we're talking about is this actual much more working seed banks. So our goal is to distribute, our goal is to essentially show that there's a way to put out hundreds of thousands of working seed banks distributed and decentralized all over the world. So in this next 6 months to 12 months, as a company, our goal is to put at least 1,000 of them out there. And we've already got pre-orders for about 150. We've just started to really kind of roll this out. And so this might be an area that we could talk about on the call is, where are these needed and how can they really kind of resource the trillion trees plus that we're looking to plant as a world. The second is training around that. We have a whole Terraformation Academy that, really can be, from beginner to expert, and can help people on that journey, because there just aren't enough trained seed collectors and seed bank operators in the world. A lot of the indigenous communities do it, already and have that knowledge, but there are other areas that can be brought in as well. The second bottleneck I mentioned is biodiversity tracking, and this is really about allowing us to, a key part to kind of making regenerative projects underwritable is digitizing and quantifying this biodiversity impact, so that these projects can then be underwritten at scale. So what we're doing is offering mobile apps that track diversity of plant species and seed banks and nurseries. And we're also working on new hardware and software that can track a full spectrum of flora and fauna, sort of above and below ground biodiversity. So there's sort of technology bottleneck. And then the third one and last one is the financing. Like I said, there's a lot of capital in the world, but it's not being applied in its very early stage way. And so what we've done is we've raised, as a venture-backed company, we've raised about 35 million to date through our seed and Series A. We actually just closed our 5 million Republic campaign, our crowd financing campaign. We just hit the limit, 5 million, about 2 days ago. So we now have 40 million that we are really deploying in this way, that we're literally writing checks from the holdco, from the business, from the operating business itself, to seed projects in all over the world, to help them get through that early stage of piloting, to show that there's real runway there. And that's part of what we're trying to address as a company. The last slide I'll show you here is some of our projects globally. The ones in South America, we can talk a little bit about, where they're probably earlier than some of the ones, for instance, in Africa and Hawaii and other places. But this is why I'm so excited to be on this call with you all, is that we're constantly growing and looking for more partnerships. So with that, hopefully I didn't take too much time. Let me just stop sharing this. With that, just super excited to open it up to questions, and Jonah, lead us away.
Great. Couple questions from me. For those who have questions, feel free to indicate your interest using the raise hand feature, or just put a note in the chat. I have a question, something like that. So Brendan, couple questions for you. First of all, you guys have a very altruistic, should I say, approach. 3 billion acres. You've got some real big ambitions. Do you see other institutions, maybe you call them competitors or partners or both? How do you regard that universe?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Yishan, I really like. I really like his mind in terms of both he's very tactical, he's very in the weeds, very R&D focused, but also has a lot of very strategic thinking around things like first principles. And for us, sort of really core first principle is that we as a company do not have ambitions to be big enough to somehow reforest the world fully to 3 billion acres. There's just not really a world where that would even be possible. We'd be 3 times the size of Coca-Cola. There would have to be such a huge company, and there's just such an urgency in this moment that waiting for any company to get to a scale to actually affect that kind of large scale change would also just frankly take too long with the issues that we face today. So from the very beginning, the way we've approached this is that we want to work across the full spectrum with partners. And it's not just a sort of buzzy world like, oh, we're collaborative, we hope to work with everyone. It actually is very much how we've approached this whole space, which is we, for instance, rarely sign NDAs. We do that because we want everything we learn and the things we build to be open sourced. The seed banks is another great example. We've built, containerized seed banks that can be shipped all over the world, solar powered, off grid, but we also offer the blueprints to folks should they want to just build their own. We don't want to keep this, we're not trying to protect our IP. We're not trying to do things that actually box out partners. We're in fact trying to make this as open source as possible, just given the time scale and the existential scale of the climate and biodiversity crisis that we're in. So when, there's probably a variety of folks on this call, and I want to say to you is, our biggest need, frankly, is great partners, because we have things that we can deploy into those partners, technology that we can offer for free, hardware that we can, either offer at cost or try to figure out ways to help you underwrite that hardware, like a seed bank. We have our whole training academy that we, are taught by our expert foresters that we offer for free. So we really are trying to create a lot of the infrastructure to scale this, and to really just say, can we show how, there's so many great projects, can we really elevate those through some of these other solutions that we've been designing? So yeah, the short answer for that is really, we work across all these different partners, and we don't really see a pathway to do it without that.
One more question for me, and then I'll start calling on the team. Christian, you'll be up next after me. Here's a question. I've looked through your materials. I've looked at your website. You guys are really obsessed with seeds. It's all about seeds. Where does that obsession come from?
It comes from kind of following the data. And what I mean by that is that, the world has sort of committed to this 1 trillion tree goal. And to plant 1 trillion trees, you need multi-trillion seeds. And there is just a worldwide shortage of native seeds that really hold us back from that. And there's just simply no way to get us to the size and scale of 1 trillion trees or more without focusing on the seeds. And, we like to kind of, this is partly, I think, a lot of us on the call probably think this way, but also I think it's a little bit of a factor of the sort of provenance of the company in Silicon Valley, which is, we tend to think about problems if we could solve for the issue of finance, solve for the issue of, of getting to a point of growth where there was abundance in resources to then direct towards this challenge, which frankly, the world is getting to that point. It's not yet there, but there were massive commitments around forestry at COP26. There's a lot of good headway being made. But if we could get to that moment, what then would actually be holding us back? And it turns out it's seeds. Seeds would be holding us back from doing that work. And that's where we really have leaned in to say, okay, well, we're going to essentially, I almost think of it as electric vehicles. We, Terraformation, and maybe many on this call, we're in the business of wanting to create massive reforestation. Electric vehicle companies are in the business of creating electric vehicles. But if you're an electric vehicle company, you won't have a customer if you don't actually also ensure there's a whole charging network across the country that allows you to charge your electric vehicle, right? No one's going to want to buy your car. There's going to be range fear, kind of all the things that come along with that. Seed banks for us is that similar, right? It's that analogy. It's really the building block to allow reforestation to scale. And Emily, I don't know if you wanted to add anything on that, actually, because this is definitely a space where you're very active.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. That was great. That's exactly right. And seeds are also the building blocks of forests. They hold the entire population's genetics. A tree on the edge of a forest could receive pollen from every other species of that tree in the forest, and therefore hold more genetic diversity than we're even aware of. And that diversity is what's going to give us resilient forests. It's forests that are resilient to the impacts of climate change. And resilient forests are our best chance against, climate change too. What we kind of learned, or what we saw at COP26, was that only a handful of species are being planted right now. And that means that either a handful of species are available, or we're only collecting for that year and we're not collecting seeds for future years. So, the problem with that is that seed availability is already seasonal. You might have droughts or fires or storms, or maybe it's just not a great pollination year that year. But with climate change being so imminent, when we're already seeing the effects now, that same genetic diversity that we see in the forest today may not be there tomorrow. We're looking at full habitat shifts. where it might be more favorable for a tree on the edge of its range, either north or south. And so those trees on the edge of their range just might not make it. And when the trees on the edge die, we're already too late. So we see that as we need to start amassing seeds right now. And that's the only way that we're going to preserve that genetic diversity that we see in the forest today for tomorrow. You know, if we are only collecting from a handful of species, we're going to see more and more monocrops. We're going to see less forests and therefore less carbon sequestration. And that's really the end goal for us. Forests sequester carbon 40%, as Brendan showed you, 40 times more than a monotypic stand. So yeah, I'd say that's about what I'd have to say on that.
Great.
Awesome.
Okay, on that note, we've got exactly 30 minutes left till the top of the hour. We have a lot of people asking questions, which is a great sign. So we're going to take two at a time, and you guys can field them. Those who are asking questions, please introduce yourself and your institution and your story, a little bit of justification of where your question comes from, so people understand a little bit about who's in the audience. So first is Christian, and then Ricardo.
Hello, everyone. Again, I'm Christian Wiesenthal, Director of Corporate Development of OEF. I'm an attorney, IP attorney, climate scientist, because I think all these tools are ways for basically, drive reforestation, which is one of my big personal focus. My question here, Brandon, thank you so much for beautiful work, number one. Thank you for answering part of my question already, because it was about seeds. And I don't know there's people who have the right level of awareness of how the seeds are the bottlenecks for reforestation, one of them, because there's just not enough seeds in the planet for this reforestation targets. So I have a three pieces question for you, even though you answered parts of it. So for reforestation, you either plant or seed casting. And if you plant, is a really big logistic undertaking that also generates a lot of plastic solid waste. And then on seed casting, the reforestation, the germination rates are extremely low, it's very wasteful. So looking at your seed banks, there has to be some level of proximity of where the seeds are going to be, brought to the environment. And my question is, taking care of the seed piece, what's your vision of the support of the logistics for the seeds to be brought into the field and actually generate into forest? So, and another question there, which I think is very pressing, is have you thought about how to use that seed infrastructure in fire damage areas? Because those areas have some advantages, because the ashes are massive fertilizer. At the same time, there's no competing species, because they're all gone now, and they'll have to bring in, be brought in by wind and other factors, which makes it a little bit more easier than areas that are degraded, but there's a lot of competition for the new seeds. So if you could speak a little bit about it. I know this is very broad. And another topic, there's a lot of reforestation techniques in Brazil that are being used for permanent conservation areas. They're just not working well. They get to an age of 2 or 3 years and they all die. And then the companies have to do the reforestation again. So if you could speak a little bit about the next step past the seed availability, which is a major piece, very beautiful solution. But what's the next step of really supporting the correct use of the seed?
Okay, before you go into that, Brendan, we're going to have one more question, so you guys can bundle your answers.
Okay.
Write down his pending questions. Ricardo.
Hi, my name is Ricardo Lomassi. Originally, I'm from Brazil. I'm living in Israel. I work with technologies from Israel. And now I'm working in a project called Amazon Tech Hub. We want to develop technologies to help the Amazon region. And I am working with a startup that they do reforestation in Amazon, and they are starting working in the Rondônia state. Rondônia state is near the border of Brazil, Peru, and Bolivia. And I would like to know which kind of partnerships are you looking for example, in Brazil or in Amazon forest, and what are you expecting from the partners? Thank
Awesome. You. Okay, these are great. I love how engaged everyone is. This is fantastic. Okay, Christian, what I might do, Emily, if you're open to it, could you talk a bit to the seed questions that he was mentioning? I think you'd probably be best placed that. And then I'm happy to talk to a little bit of the partnership stuff, or Emily, if you want to lead into that, that's cool too.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. So going back to, I think the question was, what is the vision for seeds to be brought into the field, which is a very good question. We've found that we can support broadcast seeding if it's prairie species, grass species. Those actually work best to be broadcast, whether you're talking about seed balls or blowing nutritive substance with seeds already germinated onto the ground to ensure higher germination, or I guess to ensure that they take better if they're already germinated. That works best for prairie species. When we're talking about tree species, those mostly need to be grown in a greenhouse. So usually they start on tables when they're babies. That really ensures a lot higher survivorship. You don't get the pests and other things coming in off the ground. In Hawaii, we have rat problems. So that's probably the number one, animals sneaking into your greenhouse and tearing up your plants. But yeah, for tree species, we have a stage where we usually cycle through about 30,000, 40,000 plants in a year. So they start off on trays, on tables when they're little, then they get slowly more acclimatized, and then they can be put outside when they're saplings, so that they can like harden off, right? That's what we call it. But really, I think your question is asking more about how do we support our partners from the beginning to the end. And that's really what Terraformation's mission is. We support our partners from seed to carbon, is what we like to say. So developing in every aspect of the project, and design and planting and species lists, and ensuring that everything is right for the region. And then when everything is already planted, we help our partners with monitoring as well. So we're developing some remote methods using drones and LiDAR to help monitor. And that could be anything from an agroforestry project or native restoration to a carbon project. Yeah, sorry, did I answer that question okay for you? Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just one curiosity piece is, the fire affected areas is such massive areas. In North America, the number of seed species is very, very small for trees, 3, maybe 4 types of trees. And how could that be addressed?
3 to 4. So what we do when there's a fire in an area and the trees have been wiped out that we would use for a reference forest, we look to nearby seed zones. So that's using climatic and environmental variables for each species. And we look to different reference forests to find similar ecotypic species that would do well in those areas. And we try to plant it before those invasives that you mentioned being blown in on wind and other vectors like birds. We try to get in there and plant natives first so that the invasives can't outcompete the natives. We give them a couple of years to establish, and then those areas can be managed less rigorously.
And one thing that's a little bit more sort of United States centric is that Congress passed a pretty big infrastructure bill, then became legislation, and had a lot of sort of monies allocated within it. And we're a big focus of the part of that bill that was on nature-based solutions was really related to wildfires, management, restoration, protection, sort of all these things. And so one of the things that we're really trying to figure out is, how do we provide, sort of a response to, large-scale wildfire type catastrophes from a seed banking and reforestation approach. And part of its workforce, actually, part of it, which we've heard a lot about, is connecting almost like a seed marketplace, not so much from an economic standpoint, but from a sort of demand and supply standpoint, where certain forests, maybe undergo radical wildfires that are sort of massive in scale. They may not have the seeds there to be able to reforest in the time and way that Emily was laying out. And so what we're also doing with our software is building out essentially a marketplace that helps connect, maybe it's a wildfire in California, but Oregon has the seeds. And so how do you really kind of bring those two together? And I think that could be very applicable, and we hope it is, in other parts of the world as well.
Let's move on to the next question that came from Ricardo about what kind of partners you guys looking for in the Amazon. Brendan, that's for you, and Emily, go ahead.
Oh, so, what I will say is we are early days there. So really we're looking for all kinds of partners. I'm actually right now in the process of hiring our head of South America, let's call it, someone who can be on our commercial team and really help, someone who's on the continent and can really kind of help us, particularly in this next phase, focus on seed bank, distribution and who we can partner with on those. So one thing I would just say to everyone here is, if you know anyone who you feel like could be a good fit to join the Terraformation team, who's based in South America and would have an interest in, really helping us scale the seed bank infrastructure on the continent, that would be amazing. But we really are looking to partner with indigenous communities, with nonprofits, with government or private landowners. This sort of problem of restoration isn't neat and tidy in that it fits only in one, kind of category of partnership. We really need to sort of expand out and think, who, let's bring in all variety, the IDB, for instance, the financing side, there's so many different components to it. So I think, we really look to you all, frankly, to tell us, hey, here's what we can do, here's what we need, and then we can help provide some of that or connect with other partners in our network who can. So what I'll do is I'll drop my email in the chat, and if anyone at all wants to reach out, please do, and we would love your counsel and ways that we can add value to what you're doing. Great,
thanks. We've got a bunch of questions, so let's bundle them, and I would like to ask all of those who are asking questions to be as succinct as possible. So the next 3 questions are Marisa, then Amanda, then Salo, and after Salo, then Brendan and Emily can reply. Marisa. Off mute, we haven't yet figured out.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Thank you. I would just like to better understand how you've been able to gain access to so many different parcels of land globally. That just sounds very challenging. Are you going, are you kind of going top down, going via governments and getting access that way? Or are you just kind of connecting with partners who are already on the ground, kind of already doing perhaps similar work? And then through that, you're able to kind of, collaborate together, and then you're kind of exchanging knowledge and so forth? Or how are you doing that? It just sounds like a huge challenge to me. And therefore, I'm very impressed with what you've done so far.
Great. Amanda.
Hi, as introduction, I work with Bobolink Foundation, which is focused on biodiversity and conservation, mostly in the Americas. And my question is kind of building on Marissa's question. Just curious to have a little more information about how you select the parcels of land you work on, get the permission there, select the local partners, which you've already spoken to a little bit. And then thinking about especially trying to do this kind of restoration at scale in the way you are, how one of the things that I think sort of sets this apart from other reforestation efforts is that you're trying to do it in a high quality way, thinking about biodiversity, thinking about native species, but curious how you sort of ensure the quality and monitor it and able to do that at the scale that you're aiming for.
And Salo.
Yeah, my question is on the same line, but I even take a step further. I'm not even sure if I understood correctly that you actually have own land or have possession over land. I was confused, and I wanted just like plain simple as a 6-year-old. How does Terraformation make money today? What is it selling in its commercial team, and what it hopes to be selling 5 years from now?
Great, those are all good questions, and many of them we often get. So I'm excited to see that we can provide some clarity. So how do we gain access to land parcels, and then kind of related, which is sort of who owns them? Do we own them? I'll sort of take that as one kind of category across a couple questions. Aside from a couple projects in Hawaii, which are more a sort of anomaly for the company, we don't seek to own the land. we exclusively want to partner with those that own and control the land in those places. Who are those folks? It could be a range of people. It could be private landowners. It could be governments. It could be indigenous communities that may not, sort of own the land in a way that like is more traditional to, United States, but manage it, control it, have access to it, protect it. We really want to work with those landholders on the ground locally. So we're not seeking to be a real estate company in that way. We're more of a, if you're familiar with real estate, commercial real estate, we're more of the developer. We want to work with that owner and help them develop that land. So we're not seeking to own. Governments, our partners really are, in almost, I would say, probably 75% of our cases, they are nonprofits or the community itself. It might even be more like 90%, to be honest. I mean, it is a high percentage of who we're working with, because they're the ones that, are on the ground. They know the land. They've maybe protected it for generations. There's a whole livelihoods component in it wrapped up for them. So in most cases, we're working with local communities and nonprofits. We do obviously have conversations and are working. We're still sort of advancing it, but talking to a lot of governments, both at a state level or province level, as well as a federal level, to see how we can help them unlock that. In the case of Ghana, for instance, we're working through a partner in Ghana, but it's on a large plot of, of government-owned land. So those partners really just take different shapes depending on where we are. The parcel selection part of the process, maybe I'll let Emily talk to that, and also a little bit around how we ensure. Essentially, I think someone asked, how do you ensure quality at scale? I mean, that's sort of like the sort of nub of it, right? How do we ensure that quality at scale? So, Emily, do you want to take a stab at how we select our parcels and then how we ensure quality at scale?
Sure, because they're both a very similar answer. So we go through a very robust due diligence process with people that we want to partner with. That it goes over everything from how they prep the land to who they're currently working with now, and the process for growing seedlings or storing seedlings. And it's very robust. It takes a couple months usually to get through the whole thing. And that's really, because we found that other companies in this space tend to use a form or something that's a little less impersonal, a little more impersonal, when it's sort of like a grant application. We didn't want our process to be like that. We wanted to get to know our partners, and we found that getting to talk to our partners at length, allows some of these things to come out that maybe wouldn't come out. If it's unsustainable practices, we're going to find out about that through the several questions that try to get at that. And so that's one of the ways is we have this process that we go through. But another way too is that we bring in our whole team. So as Brendan mentioned in the beginning of the call, that we have a very talented group of people all over the world. And they each are specialists in each different stage of a restoration project. So we ensure that everything's ready to go right from the beginning. So it's basically just plug and play. We have a planting plan, we have a timeline, we know where each species is going to be. So it's mainly just getting, ensuring our partners have the resources to get the project done in time. And then on the other end of that, like I was mentioning with the last question, is that we have a very intricate monitoring system that we go through as well, where we're bringing on more tech actually to help us with that. But the monitoring is definitely where we're going to be focusing in the next 5 years after most of these projects get off the ground.
And then there was the question about how you guys are making money now.
Yes, that's all. It's actually when I was in the interview process with Terraformation, that was always my question, because it's not necessarily immediately obvious, and also, it goes to the question of why did you set yourself up as a corporation versus a nonprofit? If the mission is so central to what we're doing, which for us it is. So the business model is that at the highest level, it's something we all kind of know intuitively, which is that, you know, if a piece of land, you know, if you were looking at one piece of land, a hectare, and it was, you know, sort of dry rubble with, you know, very little kind of plant or vegetation on it, and you looked at another hectare and it was, you know, a thriving forest, and you were asked, you know, which would you value more? You know, intuitively we all know we would value the biodiverse forest and land. So there's clearly value in restoring degraded land. But the question, of course, is how do you actually translate that sort of high level idea of value into actual, you know, revenue that you can build a company on? So for Terraformation, I would say two things to that. One is that, and many of you who have been in sort of high growth companies or invested in them will know this, we're more concerned right now with showing growth and market fit and demand signals and partnerships for what we're doing than we are with turning a profit. And that is something that's actually a real sort of fundamental reason why we chose to be a company and not a nonprofit, because obviously as a nonprofit, you've really got to be very conservative stewards of capital. We are also trying to be the best stewards of the capital we have, but we took on high risk, high return capital for a reason. We want to go out and try this. We want to figure out, can you do this quickly and at scale, and as a result unlock a lot more capital for all the folks who are on this call. Because what we're trying to do is not just sort of build a company for Terraformation, but actually show that an entire sector is, you know, can attract real institutional capital as well as early stage high risk capital. So one answer to your question is that today we're more concerned with showing that this model can work and that there's real growth to it, so that we can continue to grow as a company with the idea that profit comes later, which is a sort of, you know, for many folks that it's odd, you know, that makes a lot of sense, because that's a lot of what sort of early stage companies do. For others, that might make no sense, because, you know, you want to build a business with fundamentals to start, but this is the model we're taking, is to really try to get someplace quickly. The second piece, though, of like, okay, yeah, sure, all that's true, but what is the business model? So we see carbon, at least in the near term, you know, sort of 0 to 5 years, as one of the sort of most underwritable parts of a revenue model for the kind of business we're in, which is, you know, we want to not just reforest land, but then actually protect that land. We don't want to timber it in, you know, severe ways. We don't want to do things that would otherwise provide a model of revenue to underwrite it. So we see the carbon markets as the sort of first real sort of solid source of revenue in time. And we've hired actually a lot of great carbon scientists and modelers. We've hired an analyst, a senior analyst from HSBC to model out the financial sides of that. And so that's what we're doing with several of our projects right now, is figuring out what's the carbon potential revenue on that. And then sort of secondary are these other streams of revenue that were in that slide, which, Jonah, I don't mean to, if you want to jump in.
Oh, I just want to recognize the time. So if you can finish up in just
just the other revenue streams that we've mentioned, which I think are secondary at this point, but equally as important would be, you know, or let's say important, but not as important in the moment, you know, things like agroforestry, ecoservice, silvipasture, you know, things that are more traditional to those communities. And one thing I will just say, and I'll wrap it on this, is that from a carbon perspective, we believe that the majority of the value that would come out of the carbon markets needs to stay local, meaning Terraformation is not looking to sort of reap that value, that sort of, you know, this idea of like, you know, a sort of neo-colonialism around carbon. We believe that a lot of that value needs to stay in the community and on the ground, and we can help bring additional resources to, you know, to the restoration on the ground.
Great. We have 7 minutes left and 6 people want to ask questions. So I think we'll go past the top of the hour. Brendan and Emily, can either of you guys stay on after the top of the hour? Okay, great. Yep. So for those who don't get included, look forward to staying on if you can. So again, same process, 3 people, 3 quick questions. I'm going to go ahead and call on them, and then after they're finished, the interviewees will respond. So John Bruno, Mark from Nativian, and then Lucia.
Hi, this is John Bruno from the International Ecotourism Society. Thank you for a great presentation. Just wanted to ask you, What is your relationship like with the communities in which you operate? And what metrics do you have to make sure that you have a positive impact on those communities?
And then Mark?
Yes, good morning, afternoon. So Mark with Nativien, we work exclusively with indigenous communities in a process to value their traditional knowledge. What I'm hearing is, okay, you're at the very early stages of building these relationships and establishing yourself, but will come the time where you would have to interact with indigenous communities, and there is no better people to really understand what kind of seeds they need. They actually have a very dynamic seed sharing traditions. And my question was at the beginning whether or not you would be working with them, but I heard that maybe it's one of your objectives, but how do you planning on reconciling what your data set will tell you with what indigenous people will tell you, which is usually very different?
And Lucia?
Hi, thank you. This is Lucia von Reisner with Earthshot Labs. You answered most of my question, but one of the slides mentioned some of the alternative revenue streams from renewable energy and agroforestry and some of these other ways of bringing income to the land in a regenerative way. And I'm curious to what extent Terraformation sees itself being directly involved in implementing some of those alternative revenue streams, or just how that's being approached from the slide.
Jonah, should we jump in? Yeah, great.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so I'm going to take the last question first, just because I think it's one that's I can address more straightforwardly. We are not seeking to be directly involved in those additional revenue streams. What we, I almost think of it coming from a real estate background myself. I kind of always try to think of analogies between different sectors, and I almost again see it as we're trying to really be a project sponsor or a project, sort of bringing the capital, but then really empowering the subcontractors, all the other folks that do this work, to really take on that role. And so in the case of agroforestry or renewable energy, what we could see helping with is saying, okay, we can bring capital, we can bring hardware, we might bring software. There could be a way that we also bring financing to underwrite the solar. But at the end of the day, we want to work with local partners on the ground, whether that's a community, whether that's a small business, whether that's the government in some cases, to really do that actual work. We don't imagine a scenario where we are big enough to be doing the actual implementation on the ground. We certainly hope to have capacity at the HQ level and around the world to support that, but we don't envision doing that directly. The question about what's our relationship like in the communities and sort of the metric for ensuring that stays strong. So, really to date, we have heavily relied on our local partners to engage the community. There's just no one better placed to have a trusted, authentic, knowledge-driven relationship with the community than them. So we are not, in that sense, top down. We're actually very much bottom up, and that's partly why what Emily said, at one point she said, look, we have this really deep diligence process, and that's part of why is that once we pick our partner in a space after we've gone through many conversations in depth and really trust and believe in them and see, test whether they are credible in their community and how have they been engaging. When we go through that, we say, okay, yes, we're going to partner with you. We want to then trust in our partners to then, navigate the community that they live in. And we think that's a better approach than trying to sort of say from the top, this is how you should do it. Now, if there are ways that we can be helpful, for instance, maybe at a federal level or, bringing other companies to the table, of course, we want to be value add, but it's not meant to be a top-down approach. Emily, do you have thoughts on sort of, there's two questions that came out that I maybe didn't touch on yet. One is, what's the metric for ensuring that the community is sort of, engaged and involved and that's done right? And then the second question was, was about local communities having dynamic seed sharing traditions, and how do we perhaps reconcile kind of our data-driven side of this with what Indigenous people tell us and sort of more localized knowledge.
Yeah, we've learned a lot from our partners, especially in the area of mangroves. As just one example, we had a project in Ghana that we just couldn't believe that we were going to be planting 200,000 mangrove species in one area. It's a lot higher tree prescription than we're used to. But what we found out is that our partners are the best stewards of the land. They know the land, they know their species, they know what works well and what doesn't. And we had to kind of take a step back and say, okay, if we have to adjust, we have to adapt. If we're gonna work with people across the world, then we can't be so focused on what works in Hawaii, because that's not what's going to work all over the world. And we have to trust and we have to ensure it. So as far as metrics, to ensure that we're being the best partner that we can be from afar, we ask questions on an annual report about how many people on our team. And we ask questions that have to do with how many women are on your team, because we want everything to be, pretty gender equal. We're really advocates for gender equality. We also ask how many people were trained, because we're not just talking about, plants. We're also talking about people, our next generation of reforesters. How are we going to ensure that the people, our kids are also going to have this knowledge, that knowledge is being passed down. So we also ask about people being trained. And I think that's just the best way to answer that is just to say that we know that our partners are the best stewards of the land, and we know that through the due diligence process, like Brendan and I were mentioning earlier.
Great. That brings us to the top of the hour. I think a number of people will want to stay on. I'm going to begin and past top of the hour, I'm going to invite those three who haven't asked questions yet, who've indicated their interest. This is the moment where we say, okay, class dismissed, and it's water cooler time. People come together and it's unstructured sort of informal networking, at least for the next half hour. So first up, Liana, then Max and Ursula.
So I believe Liana is Liliana.
Okay.
Well, hi, thank you so much for this webinar. My question is about the biodiversity monitoring, as you identified as one of the bottlenecks. And it is for me as a biologist working at Rainforest, a venture studio in Switzerland, it seems to be one of really most challenging parts. You said you are working on that. What would that look like? What's your plan on that? Thank you.
And then let's go ahead. Let's have Max and Ursula just get their questions in.
Okay, so I'm Max, founder of Mata. It's a superfood startup using all the ingredients from the Amazon. And basically the question relates to that somehow, which is if in order to choose what species to reforestate, do you consider any additional metric besides carbon and eventually the social impact that your support? And I understand that you work always with partners, you don't do it through yourself specifically. And I saw on Jonah's notes that he mentioned Belterra and Heka. I'm not sure if you already partnered with them, but that would be an example of a project to support that on top of forest reforestation, you could eventually be helping, adding social value, right? In the sense of helping the economy and this kind of project to move forward.
And Ursula.
Yes, good evening. My name is Ursula Pero. I'm the founder of a non-for-profit. It's called Biodiversity Allies. And I also work for a for-profit project named Land for Good. And it's actually reforestation in private land. So my question is about seeds, and because of my work with Biodiversity Allies, I found that it's very difficult to exchange seeds and sell seeds and everything else because we don't have certified seeds. So what are you doing to comply with all the seed regulations that we have now?
Emily, do you want to maybe start with that one on the seed compliance piece of the puzzle?
Yeah. So the landowner is usually the owner of the seeds, and the landowner is the one who gives permission for other people to use the seeds. So I guess I've heard of a couple of seed regulations. If you're going to, I mean, as far as planting on state land, especially in Hawaii, you need to be certified. But could you tell me a little bit more, where are you encountering seed regulations?
Well, we are mostly focused with agricultural seeds. So that's the issue, you know. And one example, if you would like, let's talk about the Amazon. We have different countries. You might have a palm, I don't know, special palm in Brazil that you would like to reintroduce to the Bolivian Amazon. It's impossible to cross border with the seed. There's a lot of regulations in that area.
Yeah, so I think maybe one of the reasons why that's in place is because not all species belong everywhere. As I'm sure you're all familiar with invasive species, that's sometimes how species are spread, is through, you know, not regulating these kinds of things. But if, you know, if a species was native in both regions, then I guess you'd look to certifying whatever process you'd go through to certify that that tree can be brought into Bolivia or from Bolivia to Brazil.
Yeah, that's the issue, because there's a lot of regulations, germination rate, then you have a lot of science behind that, pathogens, number of seeds. So that is actually blocking a lot of non-for-profits to be able to do their work. So I think that we need to find something, some kind of way of doing, you know, of doing that all together. Yeah,
exactly. You just hit it on the head. And that's the exact reason why we're trying to decentralize seed banking. So it's not just one place in Brazil has these seeds. Everywhere should have access to those seeds. Everyone who's doing the work and wants to plant that native species should have access to those seeds.
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Yeah, I agree.
On the biodiversity sort of monitoring, and what does that look like? You know, it's, you know, again, being candid, it is a nascent space for us. You know, what we've been doing is having a lot of conversations with, you know, sort of those on the ground that, you know, and the sort of science of biodiversity, you know, from a perspective of, you know, we know, for instance, you know, some apps monitor bird song as one way, as a proxy for biodiversity, and, you know, the sort of the fluctuation of that in a forest or in an ecosystem. We're really interested as well in things like, how could you begin to measure the soil and things below forest, which, as many of us know, you know, not just from a biodiversity perspective, but also from a carbon perspective, you know, that has a huge impact on what those levels can be. And so what we're doing right now is, I would say we're very early in how we might monitor or measure the biodiversity on the ground. And so, you know, I would love if there are folks in this call that are expert in that. You know, we would love your ideas and, you know, ways that we might, you know, we have incredible engineers who can really design some great software, and we have a lot of sort of, you know, botanists and others who are helping shape what we measure. But I think there's really room for growing that. So that's sort of an open ask of this community, is if you have, you know, ways that you've done it that you think could be better integrated digitally, or if you have kind of thoughts on that, we would welcome that. And then, was there one more? Jonah, do you remember, did I miss one?
If you were missed, raise your hand.
Yes, what was yours, Max?
I think it was mine that was basically asking, if you consider by any chance like the social and economical element on top of the carbon and
Okay.
and
Yeah, great. That's an awesome question. So we probably, like many on this call, believe that you can't really divorce the conservation or the restoration from the economic or the community. You know, it's just having myself worked in, you know, in sort of broadly speaking, international development. I mean, there's just not a world where if you're someone who is, you know, whose basic needs aren't even met, and you're also being asked to conserve, you know, this sort of this forest that could provide, whether it's firewood or agroforestry or other, you know, resources to help you. It's just there's no way to sort of have that be winnable and have that forest or that ecosystem protected. So as a sort of first principle, we don't divorce the two in that way. And I would say, as we are continuing to sort of evolve our approach, we're recognizing how more and more our approach needs to look at very directly the economics on the ground. And so we are rapidly evolving, further evolving, let's call it, our model to say, okay, what are the ways that we can leave as much of the value creation in country as opposed to, you know, sort of exporting it out, so that there are livelihoods that are provided for. You know, this is even, I think, an issue that's not, you know, sort of specific to the global South. It's an issue that's all across the world. I mean, here in the United States, you know, we have coal country where it's, you know, there's worse poverty in coal country than in many places around the world. And part of what the challenge is how to restore land in, let's say, Eastern Kentucky and the Appalachian Mountains, while also providing what, you know, sort of some call this just transition, right? To take workers who are, you know, the poorest of the poor in our country and bring them into, you know, a paying job and look at their livelihoods in the context of restoring that surface mine, you know, or something along those lines. And so that's very much our approach, Max. It's, I think, from a measurement perspective, you know, we're still, I would say, building that out as to, you know, how many jobs are created, but we do ask our partners to report on that when they give us their, you know, their annual and semi-annual reports. Like, what was the sort of human impact part of it, not just the restoration impact part?
Great, thanks.
Yeah, great question.
It's open mic now. Christian's had his hand up.
Yeah, so I just want to speak a little bit about the seed certification aspect, because it's a very important one. As some of you might know, in Canada, there's seed eco regions, and you're not allowed to do reforestation or plantation with seeds outside of that region. And they're very small. It's very, very strongly regulated. And there's been a push for certification of native species. And certification is like standardization, which is something that agriculture wants to happen, because then all seeds behave in the same way with, you know, outside inputs, which for native species is the opposite of what you want. We want the most genetic variability as possible, because then if environmental conditions change, some of those species will survive, will be affected differently. So it's in my experience, the transport of seeds is a problem, is becoming very regulated, and also environmental problem because of invasive species and all that, which leads to a piece that you brought in the beginning, Brandon, that the seed bank infrastructure has to be very decentralized, has to be very close to where the deforestation will be as much as possible. So that's something that you know, is developing, that, you know, we'll have to deal with. But the answer of decentralizing and having the seed banks close to where they're going to be used, I think it's basically the only answer.
Yeah, I think we feel similarly. I think it's, you know, so many of these challenges are so localized, and, you know, providing a kind of centralized approach to that just doesn't make sense. And it also can be cumbersome and inefficient. And so we really, through broadly our approach, but certainly through, for instance, the hardware of our seed banks, you know, we are really just trying to decentralize and devolve this as quickly as possible to the local level, so that the judgments on the ground on which seeds and, which to replant. And, it's really meant to be a working seed bank in that capacity. The seed banks we've designed can process up to 5 million seeds a year. And so there really is like a sort of workhorse component to them. And, typically about 2/3 of the seed bank is meant for active deployment and restoration. About 1/3 is sort of reserved for storage in ours, but it really is meant to be this sort of, live, get it out there, recollect it, because, as we all know, nature doesn't, it's not like you just sort of like, change the software and you fixed it. Nature has these cycles where you can't collect seeds during certain seasons. And if you miss that season, then some large catastrophic event happens, you miss an entire couple of seasons to actually replant it. So the idea is to really provide an ongoing collection, storage, restoration, so that we can really kind of meet these goals of 1 trillion trees, which we believe is possible.
Yeah, you're completely right. Beautiful work. Thank you.
I guess I'll jump in now. Hi, Brendan. I'm Atosa Sultani, and I know about I knew about this initiative having lived on the Big Island most of the last 2 years, my temporary pandemic home. But thank you for this great conversation. It's been very interesting. I was about to put this note in the chat that I've been working with indigenous nations, about 30 nations in Ecuador and northern Peru, working to protect the headwaters of the Amazon. It's called the Sacred Headwaters Initiative. And anyways, we had just published a plan to protect the headwaters region, including restoring and reforesting 8 million hectares, which is, I think, one of the largest targets ever by 2030. We're not sure how to get there, but it's what the indigenous people's dreaming about doing. And so I was thinking how interesting it would be to have this presentation with the leadership of the indigenous organizations that I work with, facilitated in Spanish and English at some point. So I'll put this note in the chat, and if there's ever a possibility to do that, would be great to hear about it. And I really support this idea of more than carbon. We're working in the most biodiverse place on Earth. And what we're seeing is that climate change is driving species further up the mountain where they find themselves in areas that are deforested. And so species will be facing extinction as the climate warms. And reforestation is a way of actually creating biodiversity security, refugia for biodiversity. And so we really want to do this from a perspective of biodiversity more than carbon, but obviously both are important.
Yeah, and I actually really want to second that. Carbon is often vilified because it is what is contributing to to climate change. Carbon is also the sort of building block of an actual whole regenerative system, right? Most of sort of predominant life forms on our planet are all carbon based, and it's actually kind of, I think one thing is just almost a different mindset around carbon as we think of what it can be, as opposed to always just the villain, but also what can it be sort of transformed into or be a part of the solution. And two, I think, when you think of, for instance, what you're saying, Atosa, COP26 draws in 40,000 people, right? All focused on climate. The biodiversity conference that the UN puts on 2 weeks before, 5,000 people. There really isn't this appreciation of, it's not really at the end. I mean, carbon, yes, because of its existential moment around climate, but really the more fundamental is biodiversity, and how do you really kind of make that the core of, because then that diversity helps solve the climate piece. It helps solve resiliency, it's regenerative, it's food, it's sort of all of these components. So I think you're so right to say, we can't sort of lay our, just sort of hold on exclusively to this idea of carbon as as the most important measurement. The thing that I just will say is that we as a company try to figure out how to leverage large scale capital to come into the sector. We also are mindful of how to kind of marry what kind of the banking institutional investor world with this nature-based solution world. And right now, carbon is sort of is the best spot that's happening at a scale that's possible. So that's why we're really leaning into that. Is this part of building solutions is both showing what can be possible, biodiversity and where we should move, but it's also leveraging the resources that are available today to fuel that. And so that's part of why I think we also do emphasize the carbon piece, but I think you're so right in terms of it needs to be so much more than that.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to staying in touch and hopefully a way that we can create synergy with what's happening in the Headwaters region. We're in the design phase of our, how we implement this big vision, this big plan. So
Great.
Excited to hear any of your wisdom.
Gosh, well, we feel like we'd love to know yours. So we'd love to stay in touch. Please drop us a note.
Yeah, I just you have my email and link to the bioregional plan in the chat.
Okay, perfect.
And
Great.
just to let everyone know that Jonah's hopped off, so this call is pretty much over. So anyone who wants to stay on can stay on. But thank you very much, Brendan, for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. And Emily and I both so appreciate all of you, and it's been super fun. And Matt, thanks for teeing this all up, my friend, and excited to do more with you all. This is such an incredible group of folks. It was so lively. So yeah, I think just reach out to us, please, everyone who's left in this call, and we'll do the same. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for having us. Bye.
Bye.